Today we will start talking about properties of parallel lines. But before we can get there, there's certain types of angles that you will see with parallel lines. So we're going to start by talking about those. So one type of angle that you will see when you deal with parallel lines is what's called vertical angles. Okay, and vertical angles are the angles that are opposite of each other when you have lines crossing. So these are the ones that are opposite of each other when lines cross. And there is something that you have to know about those types of angles. So let's talk about what these are first, and then we'll talk about what we have to know about those angles, okay? So first of all, to have these types of angles at all, you have to have lines crossing. So if I draw two lines that cross, or in other words, intersect, you automatically have what are called vertical angles, okay? So, like I said, these are the ones that are opposite of each other. So, like, the word vertical here might throw you off because vertical we typically think kind of up and down, but these don't necessarily have to always be up and down. They just have to be opposite of each other. So if I look at my two lines, you'll see that there's some angles that are formed. So the angles are kind of formed by the two lines coming together. It's that little angle, that little part that's between them. That is an angle, okay? So I'm actually going to number my angles here. So like, and actually before I do that, let me show you kind of just the basics of vertical angles. So if you look at this angle right here, so a way to mark an angle is with a little arch. That angle is opposite of this angle down here. So those would be what's called vertical angles. And then also, if you kind of think about it, this angle right here, this angle formed by these two sides right here coming together, that angle is actually opposite of that angle. So this angle right here, and I'll mark it with two little arches instead, would be a vertical angle with that one, okay? So that's what I mean by they're opposite of each other. So this angle and that angle would be what's called vertical angles, and then this one and this one be vertical angles, okay? So if I number them, so that, let's say this is angle 1, that's angle 2, that's angle 3, and that's angle 4, then you would say that angle, that's the symbol for angle, angle 1 is a vertical angle with angle 3. So you would say angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. But then also angle 4 and 2 are also vertical. Or if we want to go numerical order, angle 2 and angle 4 would be vertical. So those are some examples of vertical angles. Okay. So now the thing that you need to know about those angles, the ones that are opposite each other, vertical angles are actually what's called congruent. And so if you think about what we've talked about, this word congruent, that means that they are the same or they are equal, okay? So what we are really saying is if you know the measure of one of the angles, then the other angle, the angle that's vertical with it or opposite of it, would also have the same measure, okay? So if you kind of want to write that in your own words, this is saying that vertical angles have the same angle measure. And so that's actually very helpful because they're going to start asking you to find the measure of some of these angles, and that is something that you can look for that's fairly easy to find. So if I gave you a problem, so let me draw two lines crossing again. I'm going to make them look a little bit different this time so you get used to seeing it in different ways. If I told you that, for instance, this angle measure right here was 20 degrees, because we tell angles by degrees, then that would actually be, if I can find the vertical angle with it, then that measure will be the same. So like notice the angle that's opposite of this angle down here would be this one up here. So because this one has a measure of 20 degrees, this one up here would also have a measure of 20 degrees. Okay, and then also if they told us, or if we were able to find one of these angle measures, like let's say that we found out or know that it's 160 degrees, then that's that angle. Well, then the angle opposite of it, which would be this one over here, would also be 160 degrees, okay? So that's something that's very helpful. So just one thing to remember is vertical angles, the angles that are opposite each other, have congruent measures, okay? So the angle measures would be equal, okay? So another type of angles that some other angles that you will see are angles that form a line. So something that you need to realize about angles that are forming a line is because they form a line, so think about a line for a second. If I had two angles that when I put them together form a line, so like let's say that we have this angle right here, and then that one and that other angle over here, so there's kind of two angles here. You got that one right there and you got that one right there. If I put those kind of right next to each other, if they form a line, so like notice these two, when I kind of put them together, they form this line right here. There's something that happens with that. So because they form a line, think about a line actually has a degree measure. It's 180 total degrees because it kind of like if you trace it, it's kind of like half a circle. So the thing you need to know about angles that form a line is that they actually add up to equal 180 degrees. And it's because when you put them together, kind of like I have these two angles right here, they form like half a circle or a line, which is 180 degrees, okay? So instead of putting those little arches, I'm going to just put like degree measures in here. So like for instance, if I told you that this angle right here has a degree measure of 40 degrees, well, you could actually find this angle right here because they form a line. So you know that if you take this angle and add it to that one, it has to equal 180 degrees. So to find this angle, all you have to do is take 180 and subtract 40, and you'll figure out what that is. So 180 minus 40, this angle would have a measure of 140 degrees. And then you could check it. If you add them, it should equal to 180, okay? So that is something that's actually very useful with these types of problems, is that angles that add, or that form a line, add to equal 180, okay? So now some other problems that you might see, you could actually have angles that form a line and it look like this. So like if you had something like that where you have lines crossing, I want you to kind of be aware of some of your angles that form a line. So I'm just going to number them. So let's say that's angle 1, 2, 3, and 4. Notice if you kind of ignore 3 and 4 for a second, so I'm actually going to cover them up, angle 1 and 2 form this line right here. So angle 1 and 2, those measures would add up to be 180. Same thing if I, for instance, cover up 2 and 3. Do you see how 1 and 4 actually form a line? So those two angles would add up to be 180. And then I could actually kind of go all the way around. Angle 3 and 4, notice they form a line, so they would add to equal 180. And so just look out for problems like this too. If they kind of, when you put them together, they form a line, then those measures would add to be 180. Okay, so now there is a term that will come up that you may have not seen so much, and that is the word supplementary. Okay, so we're going to talk about that, but this is the thing that you have to know about the angles that form a line. They are actually what are called supplementary. Okay, and the reason for that is because supplementary angles are angles that add to equal 180 degrees. And so because if you have angles that form a line, they add up to equal 180, you say that they're what's called supplementary. So anytime you have angles that when you add them up, they equal 180, then you know they're going to be supplementary angles, okay? And so, like, just to give you another example, and it doesn't always have to be just two angles. Like if you had something like this, where notice I have actually 1, 2, 3 different angles, but notice how when I kind of put them right next to each other, they form that line right there. Those 3 angles would add to be 180. Those would be what are called supplementary angles. So kind of like what we did before, if I gave you a couple measures here and you had to find that last angle, you could actually do that, because when you kind of put them together, they form that line. It's like half a circle. Then you know that these three have to add to be 180. They are what are called supplementary. So to find that other angle, kind of like what you did up here, you're going to find these all together and subtract it from 180, and you'll be able to get that one. So if I take 40 plus 60 and add them, I get 100. And then if I take that from 180 degrees, so if I subtract it from 180, I will know what that other angle is. So notice if I subtract them, I get 80. And so this other angle would have a measure of 80 degrees. Okay? So that's why kind of knowing about these angles is helpful. Another type of angle that might come up is what's called complementary angles. So complementary angles are angles that add to equal 90 degrees. Add to equal 90 degrees. Okay, so similar idea, but now the complementary ones are going to add to equal 90. So for instance, if I gave you an angle like this, and I told you that the measure of this angle was 90 degrees, or they could put a little box, because remember that little box in the corner means 90. If I kind of split this angle into two angles, notice I drew a ray there that splits it into two angles. So you have this angle on the bottom and that angle on the top. Those two angles I know would have to equal 90 degrees because they kind of make up that 90-degree angle when I put them together. Okay, so just like the other problems, if I gave you 1 degree measure, you could actually find the other one just by knowing that they add to equal 90. So if I told you that this one had a degree measure of 10, then you could actually find that one because you know if you take this one plus that one, it equals 90. So all you'd have to do is take 90 minus 10, get rid of that measure, and you'll be left with that one. And so notice this one up here has a measure of 80 degrees. So there you go. Okay, so that's what complementary means, is that you've got two angles that add to equal 90. Okay, another way that they might show that to you is if they have like your two lines crossing. If they have that even one of these angles is 90 degrees, then that would actually mean the other angles are 90, because like think about opposite angles are the same. So if this one's 90, then that one's 90. And then also, if you kind of think about what we talked about a minute ago, this angle and this angle form a line, so then you know that one would be 90 as well. Okay, and so like if I took and split up one of these 90-degree angles, then you know that these two would have to be add to equal 90 degrees. So like just like I did before, if I give you one of these degree measures, let's say that that one has a measure of 40 degrees, then you would actually be able to find that one. Okay, because this whole angle would be 90 degrees. So you could take 90 minus 40, and you would know that this one would have to be 50 degrees. Okay, so that's kind of just how to practice it. Now we're going to just run through a couple problems so you can see how it works in action. Okay, so in number 1, it says that you have to find the missing angles. Okay, so they give you this angle, and then you have to find this one. So we're kind of looking, what is the measure of that angle? Well, kind of think about all the stuff we talked about up here. Which scenario is going on? Do we have lines crossing with angles opposite each other? Do we have angles that are forming a line? Or do we have something like this? Do we have like just angles forming a line that are supplementary? Or do we have angles that kind of form a 90-degree angle? So if you look at this one, you've got an angle and another angle, and they're forming a line. So that means that they are going to add to equal 180. Okay, so if I take whatever the angle measure is here and add it to the 30, it should equal 180. So how do I find that one? Well, I could just get rid of this 30 degrees, and I'll be left with you know, the measure of the side or the angle that I'm missing. So if I take 180 and subtract that 30, I get 150. And so that would be this angle right here. So this angle is 150 degrees. Okay, so, and you can check it because these should add to be 180, and so that works. Okay, so we found that missing angle. In this one, you have to find all three of these missing angles. Well, think about the problems that we've done. And if you notice, we've got two lines crossing. So when we have two lines crossing, we look for vertical angles. So we're looking for the angles that are opposite each other. So which angle would be opposite of that? Well, that would be this angle over here. So this one would actually be the same as that one, because if you think about it, we know that vertical angles are congruent, or they're equal, okay? So because this one has a measure of 42 degrees, this one would also be 42 degrees. Now, how do we find the other ones? Well, if you think about what I talked about over here, when we were talking about angles that form a line, I had told you whenever there's two lines crossing, you actually do have angles forming lines. And so the angles that are kind of right next to each other are going to be the ones that are forming lines. And so if you look, if I kind of cover up this one right here, this angle right here, and then this one are forming a line. So these two would add to be 180. So I can actually find that angle by doing kind of like what I did for this last problem. I could take 180 and subtract that angle, and that will tell me what this angle is right here. So if I take 180 minus 42, I get 138. And so that's the degree of this one right here. It's 138 degrees. Okay, so now how do I find this other angle? Well, there's actually a couple ways you could do it. You could realize, oh, this one's opposite of that one, so that would have the same measure because they're vertical. Or if you kind of look, like for instance, if you look here, this angle and that angle form a line. So you would know that these two have to add to be 180. So you could do kind of the same thing that you did here. So either way you do it, you should get that this one is 138 degrees. Okay, so then number 3, what's going on with number 3? Well, number 3, we have to find actually x, what the measure of x is. Okay, so let's look at what's going on in the picture. I noticed that this one right here, this angle down here has a measure of 90 degrees. So if we kind of think about what we did up here, I talked about if you have one that has a 90-degree angle, then with these two lines that are crossing, all of these other ones would have a 90-degree angle or be 90-degree angles. So if I think about that, this one and this angle right here as a whole, this entire angle would have a measure of 90 degrees. And so if I kind of think about that, if this whole angle is 90 degrees, this one just from here to here is 63. How do I find that one? Well, you could just take 90 and get rid of this angle, and you'll be left with x. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 90 minus the 63, and that will tell me what this measure is right here. So 90 minus 63 ends up being 27. So x has a measure of 27 degrees. And you could check it. If you take 63 plus 27, it should equal 90. Okay, so last one with just practicing finding angles. So this one's the same kind of thing as like what we did here, but notice it's kind of asking us in a different way. So here, if you see something like this, the M means measure. That's the symbol for angle. So this is saying you're finding the measure of angle 1, the measure of angle 2, and the measure of angle 3. So we're just finding our missing angles here, okay? So you can actually think about it exactly how we did this one. You have two lines crossing, so you know the opposite angles, the vertical angles, will be congruent. So because this one's 125, that one's, the angle 2 is the one that's opposite of it, so that one would be the same. And then if you think about it like this angle 2, or this angle right here, and then that one, if you kind of look at it, or if you want to cover up the other part of your picture, these two form a line. So I know that this angle plus that angle has to equal 180. So to find angle 3, I would take 180 minus the 125, and that'll show me what this angle is. So when I do that, I end up getting 55 degrees. Okay, so then how do I find that one? You could actually find it one of two ways. You could realize that these two are vertical angles, so this one would be the same as that one. Or if you look like this and this one form a line, or if you look at like maybe this, these two form a line, you could subtract this from 180 and you'll get that. Okay, so either way, you end up getting that as 55 degrees. Okay, so to label this one, you would say the measure of angle 1 is equal to 55 degrees. The measure of angle 2 is equal to 125 degrees. And then the measure of angle 3 is equal to 55 degrees. Okay? So then, that's just practicing finding the angles. So now you're going to have problems that actually you have to set up an equation to solve them. Okay? You're going to use the same knowledge that you had, but now you have to actually set up an equation, and then you go from there. All right? So like with number 4, notice you have to find the value of x. Okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to look at what you're given, and you're going to see, what do I know about those angles? And so notice we're given this angle right here, and we're given this angle over here. What do I know about these types of angles? Well, those would be our vertical angles. And so think about what you know about vertical angles. Vertical angles are congruent, or in other words, they are equal. So if they are equal, then how do we set up an equation to help us find x? Well, if they are equal, then you set them equal to each other. That's how you set up the equation. So I know that these are equal. So notice I'm going to take one of my angles, which is the 2x plus 2, and I set it equal to the other angle. Okay, so that is your equation. Now you use what you know about solving equations. So we've got to get our x by itself. So to do that, we actually start by subtracting our 2. So these will go away, and remember you have to do it to both sides. So my 2x will come down, and then you have 88 minus 2, which is 86. And then from there, you're multiplying x by 2, so the opposite would be to divide by 2, so you have to do that to both sides. So after you do that, 86 divided by 2 is 43, and that's the value of x. So now if they asked you to actually find the variable, what you would do is you would take this 43 and you would plug it in for x. So let's do that. So if I actually, or excuse me, if they ask us to find the angle, we would plug it in. So I'm going to just take my 2x plus 2, and I'm going to plug in my 43. So instead of x, you put in the 43, just like that. And then you can simplify it. So 2 times 43 is 86, and then we add 2. 86 plus 2 is 88. So notice this angle has a measure of 88. And that should make sense because it should have the same measure as the vertical angle with it. All right? So then what would we do for number 5? Well, what do you know about these types of angles? Notice this angle is opposite of this angle when you had 2 lines crossing. So that's actually the same story as what we had over here. Opposite angles, or vertical angles, are equal. So we set them equal. So you take one of them and set it equal to the other one. And then, oh, that's not an x. And then you solve. Wow. Let's get myself together here. All right, so you take one, set it equal to the other, and now we're going to solve. So this time we have variables on opposite sides, so we want to get them together first. So to get this 3m over here, I'm going to actually do the opposite. So I'm going to subtract 3m to both sides. So these go away. 5m minus 3m is 2m, and then the 16 comes down. And then from there, I'm multiplying by 2, so I got to divide by 2. So m would equal 8. So again, if they ask us to actually find the measure of the angles, you're going to take whatever you got and you're going to plug it in. So let's do that. So if I plug it in here, it would be 5 times m is 8, so it'd be 5 times 8. So the measure of this angle right here would actually be 40 degrees. And then this one, you could do it one of 2 ways. You can remember that this is the same measure as that, so you would know it'd be 40, or you could plug in your 8 right here, and it'd be 3 times 8 plus 16, which either way you do it would give you that that one has a measure of 40 degrees. Okay, so last one. What do we do here? Well, notice this is a little different because they're not really giving us opposite angles anymore. These two are kind of right next to each other. So then think about what kind of angles those would be. If they're right next to each other, Remember how I kind of covered up pieces of my graph before? Do you notice how this angle and that angle form that line? So these are actually angles that form a line. So think about what you know about those. Angles that form a line add up to equal 180. So you're not going to be setting them equal. It's saying that you have to add them up to equal 180. So that actually tells you what you have to do. So if we have to set up an equation here, I know that these form a line, so I literally have to take one of them and add it to the other one, and then it'll equal 180. So that's what I do. So I take 20t plus 5, that's one of my angles, plus the other one, which is 15t. And when I add them up, so I'm adding them, they equal 180. Okay, so notice that's how you set up your equation. And then, just like you did the other ones, we've got to use what we know about solving equations. So in this problem, I've got variables on the same side of my equation. So when you have that, you combine like terms. So my 20t is going to combine with this 15t. So when I combine them, I get 35t, and then that plus 5 comes down, and then I just bring down my equals 180, and then I keep solving. So now I'm going to get my variable by itself. So I'm going to subtract my 5, then my 35t comes down, and then equals 180 minus 5 is 175. And then, well, how do I get t by itself? It's being multiplied by 35, so I'm going to divide by 35. And then after I do that, my 35 over 35 is 1. And then 175 divided by 35 is 5. So that's t. So now again, if they ask you to actually find the angles, you take the t, you take what you found t to be, and you plug it in. So for this one, I take my equation, and instead of t, I'm going to plug in my 5. So it'd be 20 times 5 plus 5. And so when I simplify that, that one would end up being 105 degrees. And then to find this one, you can remember that these have to add up to be 180. So you could take 180 minus that, and you'd get that. Or you could take 5 and plug it in for t here. So either way, you'll get the same answer. So if I take 5 and plug it in, I get 15 times 5, which is 75. And then also notice if you take 180 minus this, you're going to get 75 as well. Okay? So that is all about the angles that you need to know for parallel line, or the properties of parallel lines.